This is an abandoned 1988 Acura Legend that I won on eBay for just $350. Why so cheap? Because it sat outside for 10 years with a leaking sunroof and nobody could get it to start. The interior was so wet that in addition to the leather seats disintegrating, there was also green algae growing on the floor. The exterior was weathered as well, but before I bothered fixing any of that, I wanted to get it running and make sure the engine and transmission were still good. After trailering it home, I found that the dash had already been taken apart and someone had replaced the main relay. First, I checked all the fluids, and they looked good, except for the coolant, which was about half a gallon low. I also pulled the upper timing cover off partway just to confirm that the timing belt was still intact and not dry rotted or broken. I replaced the broken positive battery cable and borrowed a battery from one of my Toyotas. Now with power to the car, I turned on the ignition to listen for the fuel pump priming, but heard no sound from the fuel pump. The good news though was that all of the interior electronics seemed to be working, with the exception of the sunroof and power antenna. I figured no fuel pump prime was the reason the previous owner replaced the relay, hoping for a simple fix. So I removed the rear seat to inspect the fuel pump. And it was disgusting. I ran 12 volts directly to the pump, and it was indeed very dead. And while that was out, was the ideal time to pump all the 10-plus-year-old gas from the fuel tank. Also disgusting. While I waited for the new fuel pump to arrive, I checked all the fuses, and the only one that was blown was a 15-amp fuse for the ECU. Which made sense. The sunroof had leaked mostly on the passenger side, and on these cars, the ECU just so happens to be located under the passenger seat. I replaced the 15-amp fuse and tried starting the car again, and the fuse didn't blow. That made me think that at one point there must have been a good amount of water sitting on the floor of this car to cause a short at the ECU. I unbolted the passenger seat, removed some interior trim, and pulled up the carpet and sound deadening to find standing water. I removed the ECU and none of the pins were corroded. Now I could pull the carpet and sound deadening up all the way, and I found a lot more water. The good news though is that there was absolutely no rust on the floor. So I soaked up all the water with towels and let the interior dry out for a week. The new fuel pump arrived and I swapped it over to the original sending unit. After a successful 12-volt test, I dropped it back into the clean, empty tank. I needed to remove the old fuel that was still in the fuel lines, so I disconnected the end of the fuel line in the engine bay. I tossed in a battery, added some fresh gas, and the Legend now had a working fuel pump. I primed the pump a couple of times to send some fresh fuel through the line to expel the old gas. And after reconnecting the fuel line, it still wouldn't start. Not even a sputter. No spark. The cap and rotor were definitely old, but weren't too bad to cause no spark at all. After seeing all the water that was inside the car, as well as the blown ECU fuse, I figured the ECU was probably fried and ordered another used one from eBay. 1 week later, it was out with the old ECU and in with the new. Then the Legend slowly sputtered to life. Barely. It was running rough and definitely not on all 6 cylinders. Next on the checklist of things to replace were the fuel injectors. While I waited for a set of 6 rebuilt injectors to arrive, I figured I'd remove the sunroof to see why it wasn't working, and clean out all of the sunroof drains to prevent any more water from leaking inside. Not only was the motor crusty, but the metal cables that moved the sunroof itself were completely rusted in place. I removed the entire sunroof assembly in hopes that letting the cables soak in penetrating oil might free them up. Unfortunately, all of the individual parts of the sunroof assembly, including the cables, were discontinued by Acura and no longer available. I looked for a used sunroof assembly in the meantime, and there were absolutely none available. While I waited on the injectors, I changed the oil and filter, cap and rotor, fuel filter, and flushed the brake fluid. And there was still a lot of the old nasty fuel in the line, so I primed the pump a few more times while I had the line disconnected. And installed new spark plug wires. Next, the injectors arrived. The first step was removing the injector clips and unplugging the harnesses. Then removing the fuel rails. And the old injectors were definitely gross. And now this Acura Legend ran great. I purchased the correct size battery so I could close the hood all the way. And this Acura Legend moved under its own power for the first time in a decade. The tires were from 2005 and cracking from age. One had a huge gash in the sidewall. So I only took it for a quick trip down the street to see if the transmission shifted through all of the gears. And it did. So I ordered some new Goodyears for these 15-inch Inky EK90 wheels. When removing the wheels to bring them to a tire shop to have the new tires installed, I noticed that one of the wheels had a decent bend on the inside lip. So I decided I'd try to repair it myself using a bottle jack and fire. I was making weekly videos of all the repairs to this car, and this one got a lot of skepticism. It looked sketchy, but the wheel was perfectly round after the repair. And when I had the new tires mounted and balanced, the wheel I repaired actually needed less balancing weights than the others. I'll put links to all of the individual videos in the description. The sunroof and headliner were still out of the car, and I wasn't able to find another used assembly. After weeks of soaking the cables in penetrating oil, they were still seized. I really wanted to find another working assembly, but couldn't let that hold up the restoration any longer. It was finally time to wash the car and start working on repairing the damaged clear coat, so I reinstalled the seized sunroof. After giving the car its first bath in over a decade, I used a clay bar to remove all imperfections from the paint. Most of the car's paint was going to be able to be brought back to a deep shine by polishing. The bumpers had scratches and chips, so I removed those and filled in all the imperfections. I also removed the headlights at the same time, so there would be less to mask off. However, the driver fender, hood, roof, and top of all the doors had badly faded and flaking clear coat. And once the clear coat had left the chat, there was no UV protection for the metallic red base coat, which was now starting to turn pink in those areas. All of those areas needed to be sanded down with 800 grit and have new base coat applied over the faded areas and blended into the original surrounding base coat that was still good. Then, the entire panels had to be re-cleared. The doors brought an additional challenge because there was no trim or edge where I wanted to stop painting, and I didn't want to paint the entire top half of the door down to the trim strip where I could hide a masking line. So I had to blend the new clear that I applied over the fresh base coat at the top of the doors with the factory clear coat farther down the doors and rear C-pillar. That was something that I had never attempted before, but I used a spot blender and it actually came out looking great. However, I'm not a professional painter and my residential garage doesn't make an ideal paint booth, so I ended up with some dirt in the clear and some orange peel, mostly on the hood. After letting the paint cure for 1 week, I got to work wet sanding the clear coat to remove any imperfections and orange peel. I started with 1200 grit, and then sanded again with 1500 grit, and then 2000 grit. After wet sanding, I polished the paint with Meguiar's Ultra Cut Compound. By this time, it was mid-November, so I put the Legend in storage for the Ohio winter. Over winter, I purchased all the parts I needed to replace the timing belt, as well as all of the coolant hoses. Once the weather warmed up, I got to work on replacing the timing belt, which was quite a long job. I've done timing belts on plenty of Honda D-Series engines, but this C27A engine didn't offer much room to work on replacing the timing belt. The crank pulley bolt was seized, so I used a breaker bar and the power from the starter to crack the bolt loose. And then I saw that the water pump was leaking, which explained why the coolant was so low. Next, I drained the coolant and removed the old water pump. Only to find a lot of corrosion on the mounting surface, which was causing the leak. I cleaned up the mounting surface and installed the new water pump. And then the new tensioner and timing belt, made sure everything was lined up at top dead center, and reinstalled everything else. Along with new spark plugs, fresh hoses, and coolant. The $350 Acura Legend was running perfect now and no longer leaking coolant. But the interior was absolutely horrendous with the cracking and splitting leather seats. I went to 3 different upholstery shops. They all had an 8 to 12 month wait and the minimum price started at $2,000. That was way out of my budget, so I found a much less expensive DIY option. For $365 shipped, I got a set of custom-fit gray vinyl covers that looked similar to the leather seats. They slid right over the original seats, so installation was a breeze. Although they weren't 100% perfect and they weren't quite as comfortable as leather, I was happy to have the interior looking as good as the exterior. Now, it was finally ready to drive. But there was one more detail on the exterior that needed attention. Right beside the new paint was the old cracking and flaking black trim along the top of the doors. So I pulled the trim off, sanded it down, filled in any imperfections, and refinished it to a factory satin black. Now the Legend was completed. I had about $1,800 into the car, and that's including the original $350 purchase price. I drove the Legend that summer, and it got more looks than any of my other vehicles. Not only was it a surviving 1988 Legend in Ohio, where old cars rust away, but it was the only first-gen Legend I've ever seen on the road here. I think people stared at it because of the clean Persian red pearl paint and color-matched EK90 wheels, but also because nobody around here even knew what kind of car it was. I loved driving the car, but I knew I couldn't keep it. I needed space to work on my next project, merging 2 crappy 1980 Toyota long beds to make one decent truck. And the Legend was never going to be driven through another winter, let alone parked outside. So I ended up trading it for a Honda Fit Sport, which I wasn't initially interested in, but had everything the Legend didn't. Parts availability, great fuel mileage, and some rust. So I didn't feel guilty about driving it through the winter. I do miss cruising around in a Legend, and I hope it's in good hands. But the most rewarding part of the whole restoration was one specific comment that I received from the grandson of the original owners. Maybe it was the rare color-matched inky wheels, or the story of how I got the car, but he recognized it in the video and knew I had purchased it from his uncle on eBay. He said he had so many memories of this 88 Acura Legend as a kid and thanked me for restoring it. And that's what I love most about saving and restoring a vehicle in poor condition that would have otherwise been scrapped and forgotten, is that now it's back to new condition for others to see and enjoy a piece of automotive history for generations to come.
That one doesn't need to ride a book. This one needs to ride a book.
Thanks for watching.